Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories, hello everyone, I'm Paula. And trust me, you're going to want to hear how my life spiraled out of control. The day I married Marcos felt like the start of a beautiful journey. Our wedding was a modest affair, held in the small church in the town where we both grew up. The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors across the faces of our family and friends who had gathered to celebrate with us. Marcos stood at the altar, his smile as wide as I had ever seen it, and when our eyes met, I knew I had found my forever, we didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. After the ceremony, we hosted a simple reception in the garden of my parents' house. There was laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts to our future. We danced under the stars, our dreams intertwined like the branches of the old oak tree that shaded us. I remember thinking that nothing could ever come between us, a few months after the wedding, Marcos suggested we move to his family's farm, located a few hours away in the countryside. His father, Javier, had been living alone since his wife passed away, and Marcos felt a strong sense of duty to help him. It wasn't an easy decision for me. I had never lived in such a rural setting, and the thought of leaving the familiar comforts of our town filled me with unease. But I loved Marcos, and I knew how much the farm meant to him. So, with some trepidation, I agreed. The drive to the farm was long and winding, taking us through rolling hills and dense forests. As we neared our destination, Marcos began to share stories from his childhood, memories of working alongside his father, tending to the animals and fields. There was a light in his eyes as he spoke, a deep connection to the land that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. I began to realize that this place was more than just a piece of property to him, it was a part of his soul. When we arrived, Javier greeted us with open arms. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his hands rough from years of hard labor. Despite the sadness that lingered in his eyes from the loss of his wife, he welcomed us warmly, showing us to the house where we would live. It was a charming wooden structure, with a large porch that overlooked the sprawling fields. The house had an air of nostalgia about it, filled with the memories of the family that had built it from the ground up, as I unpacked our belongings, I felt a mixture of emotions, excitement for the new adventure, but also a deep sense of unease. The farm was beautiful, but it was also isolating, far removed from the life I had known. I wondered if I would ever truly feel at home there, The first few weeks on the farm were a blur of new experiences and challenges. I quickly learned that life in the countryside was nothing like the life I had left behind. The days started early, long before the sun had fully risen, and were filled with tasks that I had never done before. I spent my mornings feeding the chickens, milking the cows, and learning the basics of gardening under Javier's patient guidance. In the afternoons, I cleaned the house, prepared meals, and tried to make our new home as comfortable as possible, Marcos, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in this environment. He would wake up before dawn, eager to start his day working the fields alongside his father. Watching him, I could see how much he had missed this life. The farm brought out a side of him that I hadn't seen before, a deep connection to the land, a sense of purpose that made him come alive. It was both beautiful and bittersweet to witness, as I realized that while Marcos was reconnecting with his roots, I was struggling to find my place, as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel increasingly isolated. Marcos was often too busy to spend much time with me, and I found myself alone for long stretches of the day. The farm was peaceful, but the solitude was overwhelming. I missed the bustle of the town, the familiarity of my old life, and most of all, the closeness I had once shared with Marcos, It was during these lonely days that I began to spend more time with Javier. He had a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that I found comforting. He would tell me stories about his life, about how he and his wife had built the farm from nothing, about the love they had shared. There was a wistfulness in his voice when he spoke of her, a deep longing that resonated with my own feelings of loneliness, At first, our relationship was nothing more than a friendship. I appreciated his company, and he seemed to enjoy having someone to talk to. But as time went on, I found myself drawn to him in ways I hadn't expected. There was a warmth in his gaze, a kindness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew it was wrong. I was married to his son, after all, but I couldn't help the growing connection between us, One warm evening, while Marcos was away on a trip to town, Javier and I found ourselves alone on the farm. We had spent the day working in the garden, and as the sun began to set, we sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers. It was a perfect evening, the kind that made the world feel at peace, but inside, I was anything but peaceful. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the tension between us, a tension that had been building for weeks. I knew I should go inside, put some distance between us, but I couldn't bring myself to move. When I glanced over at Javier, I saw that he was watching me, his expression unreadable, Paula, he began, his voice low and hesitant. There's something I need to tell you, I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. What is it, Javier, he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I know this isn't right, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. I knew I should have stopped him, should have said that we couldn't do this, but instead, I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn by a force I couldn't explain, before I knew it, his lips were on mine, soft and tentative at first, then more urgent as the kiss deepened. The world seemed to fall away in that moment, leaving only the two of us, lost in a haze of passion and need. It was reckless, it was wrong, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world, Afterward, as we sat together in the fading light, the reality of what we had done began to sink in. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the guilt that followed was overwhelming. I knew I had betrayed Marcos in the worst possible way, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The connection I felt with Javier was something I hadn't experienced in years, something I had been craving without even realizing it, From that night on, everything changed. Javier and I tried to keep our distance, to pretend that what had happened was just a moment of weakness, but it was impossible. The pull between us was too strong, and we found ourselves seeking out moments to be alone together, to steal kisses and touches when no one was looking. Our affair became a secret we both cherished and dreaded, knowing that if it were ever discovered, it would destroy everything, but secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully they are guarded. Pedro, one of the longtime farm hands, had been with the family for years. He was loyal and hard-working, and I had always admired his dedication. But lately, I had noticed him watching me with a look that I couldn't quite decipher, One afternoon, while Marcos was out repairing a fence on the far side of the property, Pedro approached me in the barn. I was alone, stacking hay bales, trying to keep my mind off Javier and the tangled web of lies we were living, Dona Paula, Pedro began, his voice hesitant, can I talk to you? I turned to him, trying to hide the anxiety bubbling up inside me. Of course, Pedro. What is it, He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the ground. I saw something, Dona Paula. Something I shouldn't have seen, my heart stopped. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what he was about to say. What did you see, Pedro? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, He hesitated, his brow furrowed in concern. I saw you and Dom Javier, in the barn, the other afternoon, panic surged through me. This was it. The moment I had been dreading. Pedro knew. And if Pedro knew, it was only a matter of time before everyone else did too, especially Marcos, Pedro, please, I started, but he cut me off, I don't want trouble, Dona Paula, he said quickly. I need to tell Don Marcos. He deserves to know the truth, no. I cried, reaching out to grab his arm. Please, Pedro, don't do this. You don't understand, he pulled away, his expression conflicted. I understand, Dona Paula. I understand that what you're doing is wrong. And Don Marcos deserves to know the truth, before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling with fear and desperation, my mind raced as I tried to think of a way to stop him, to keep him from telling Marcos. But I knew it was futile. The truth was out, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, that evening, as Marcos returned from the fields, I could barely look at him. I knew it was only a matter of time before Pedro told him everything, and the thought of that conversation made me sick to my stomach. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the world to come crashing down around me, and when it did, I wasn't ready, the confrontation came the next morning. I had woken early, still lost in my thoughts, when I heard angry voices outside. I rushed to the window and saw Marcos and Pedro standing near the barn, their faces tense, voices raised. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew the moment had come. My stomach twisted with dread, moments later, Marcos burst through the door, his face a mask of fury and pain. Paula, he growled, his voice trembling, is it true, I froze, the world spinning around me. Marcos, is it true, he repeated, louder this time, his eyes burning with anger, I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. Yes, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. It's true. Marcos staggered back, as if I had struck him. He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and devastation. How could you, he choked out. How could you do this to me, to us, I'm sorry, I sobbed, my heart breaking as I saw the pain I had caused him. I'm so sorry, Marcos. It wasn't supposed to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, he shook his head, his expression hardening. You betrayed me, Paula. You betrayed our marriage, our love, and with my own father, I know, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I know I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life, Marcos turned away, unable to look at me any longer. I can't stay here, he muttered. I can't even look at you right now. I need to go, Marcos, please, I pleaded, reaching out to him. Don't leave. We can try to fix this. We can talk about it. But he was already heading for the door. There's nothing to talk about, Paula. It's over, and with that, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, numb with shock, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Marcos was gone, and I had no idea if he would ever come back, the days that followed were a blur of grief and regret. Marcos didn't return, and the silence in the house was deafening. Javier, who had been away on an errand when the confrontation happened, returned to find me in tears, my heart shattered, what happened, he asked, his voice filled with concern as he pulled me into his arms, I could barely get the words out. Marcos knows. Pedro told him everything. He's gone, Javier. He left, Javier's face paled as he took in my words. Oh, Paula. I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. Neither did I. But the damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. The guilt was suffocating, a constant weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I had destroyed the one thing that mattered most to me, my marriage, and I didn't know how to move forward, the the farm, once filled with life and energy, became a shadow of its former self. The workers went about their tasks in silence, their eyes filled with pity and disapproval whenever they looked at me. I could hear their whispers, their judgments, and I couldn't blame them. I had become the very thing I had always feared, a woman who had betrayed her husband, who had torn her family apart, Javier tried to comfort me, but his presence only made the pain worse. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of what we had done, of the lines we had crossed. Our relationship, once so full of passion and excitement, now felt like a burden we both had to carry, "We can't go on like this," Javier said one evening as we sat on the porch, the weight of our actions hanging heavily between us. "We've hurt too many people, Paula. We need to make things right, how?" I asked, my voice hollow. "How do we make this right, Javier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going to leave the farm. It belongs to Marcos, and it always should have. I'll sign it over to him, and then I'll go. Maybe with time, he'll come back and take over, and me?" I asked, tears welling up in my eyes. "What am I supposed to do, You need to find a way to heal, Paula," Javier said gently. "You need to forgive yourself for what's happened and find a way to move on, but I didn't know how to do that. The guilt was too overwhelming, the pain too deep. I couldn't imagine a life without Marcos, but I also couldn't imagine a life where I continued to hurt him by staying here. In the end, I knew Javier was right. I had to leave, too. I had to find a way to rebuild my life, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known, leaving the farm was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I packed my bags with trembling hands, each item I placed inside a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The day I left, Javier and I stood on the porch one last time, looking out over the fields that had once held so much promise, "Take care of yourself, Paula," Javier said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I hope you find peace, I hope you do, too, Javier," I replied, tears streaming down my face. "Goodbye, we embraced for the last time, and then I walked away, not looking back as I left the farm, and my old life, behind, for weeks. I wandered from town to town, unable to settle in one place. I took odd jobs to make ends meet, but nothing felt right. The weight of my guilt followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I was haunted by thoughts of Marcos, wondering where he was, if he was okay, if he would ever forgive me, Eventually, I found my way back to the city where I had grown up. It wasn't a conscious decision. I had simply run out of places to go, and the familiarity of home called to me in my darkest moments. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and found a job at a local bookstore. The work was simple, but it was comforting, and the solitude of the shelves gave me the space I needed to think, day by day, I began to rebuild my life. I still thought about Marcos every day, but I tried to focus on the present, on the small steps I was taking to heal. The guilt was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had once been. I was starting to breathe again, starting to see a future for myself, Then, one evening, as I was closing the bookstore, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a late customer. I looked up, expecting to see a familiar face from the neighborhood, but instead, I was met with a pair of eyes I hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime, Paula, the voice was tentative, uncertain, but there was no mistaking who it belonged to. My heart skipped a beat as I turned fully to face him, Marcos, I whispered, my voice catching in my throat, He stood there in the doorway, looking older, wearier than I remembered, but still very much the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I heard you were back in town, he finally said, stepping further into the store. I wasn't sure if I should come see you, but I couldn't stay away. My mind raced as I tried to process the fact that he was standing in front of me. That after all this time, he had sought me out. I hadn't expected to see him again, not after everything that had happened, I don't know what to say, I stammered, the flood of emotions overwhelming me, He smiled, but it was a sad, strained smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't have to say anything, Paula. I needed to see you. To talk to you, I nodded, still trying to wrap my mind around his sudden appearance. Of course. Let me just finish locking up, and we can go somewhere to talk, Marcos waited patiently as I hurried to close the store, my hands trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. Once everything was secure, we stepped out into the cool night air. I wasn't sure where to go. There were too many memories attached to every place in this city, but Marcos seemed to know exactly where he wanted to take me, We walked in silence for a few blocks, until we reached a small park, the kind that was quiet and secluded, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We found a bench under a large oak tree and sat down, the distance between us both comforting and painful, I've thought about this moment a lot, Marcos began, his voice soft and measured. What I would say to you if I ever saw you again. How I would feel. But now that I'm here, I don't even know where to start, I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Marcos, I'm so sorry. For everything. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen, He nodded, his eyes focused on a spot in the distance. I know. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it, trying to make sense of why it happened. For a long time, all I felt was anger. Anger at you, at Javier, at myself. But that kind of anger, it eats away at you. I couldn't live like that anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to him speak, the pain in his voice cutting through me like a knife. I understand if you hate me, Marcos. I hate myself for what I did, He shook his head, finally turning to look at me. I don't hate you, Paula. I don't think I ever really could. I loved you, still love you, in some ways. But what happened, it changed everything. It broke something in us that I don't know if we can ever fix, The tears spilled over, and I wiped them away with trembling hands. I wish I could go back and change it all. I wish I could take it all back, Marcos reached out and took my hand, his touch both familiar and foreign after so much time. We can't change the past, Paula. All we can do is try to move forward, His words were like a balm to my wounded soul, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Do you think we could ever find a way to be friends again? To at least be a part of each other's lives, Marcos looked down at our joined hands, a contemplative expression on his face. Maybe, he said after a long pause. Maybe, with time. But I think we both need to heal first. We both need to figure out who we are now, after everything that's happened, I nodded, understanding the truth in his words. We had been through so much, and the wounds we had inflicted on each other were still too raw. But the fact that he was willing to even consider the possibility of friendship was more than I had ever hoped for, I'm glad you came, Marcos, I said, squeezing his hand. It means a lot to me, he smiled, a genuine smile this time, and it was like a ray of light breaking through the darkness. I'm glad I came too. I needed this closure, I guess, We sat there for a while longer, talking about the mundane details of our lives since we had last seen each other. It was strange, but also comforting, to slip back into the familiar rhythm of conversation. And when it was time to part ways, there was no bitterness, no anger, just a quiet understanding that we were both on our own journeys toward healing, As I watched Marcos walk away, disappearing into the night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. A chance to finally move forward, to start over, and to find a way to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made, but as I turned to leave the park, something caught my eye. Something small and shining on the ground near the bench where we had Saturday. I bent down to pick it up, and my breath caught in my throat, it was a ring, Marcos's wedding ring. The one he had worn on the day we exchanged our vows. The one he had refused to take off even after everything fell apart, my heart pounded as I stared at the ring in my hand, the weight of it heavy with meaning. Had he dropped it accidentally? Or had he left it for me to find, a final gesture of closure, I looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but he was already gone. I stood there for a long moment, the ring clutched tightly in my hand, trying to make sense of what it meant, and then, with a deep breath, I slipped the ring into my pocket and walked away. My story wasn't over yet. There were still chapters to be written, still lessons to be learned. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally on the right path, a few days after my encounter with Marcos, I was beginning to find a sense of normalcy in my new life. The bookstore became more than just a place of work. It was a sanctuary where I could lose myself in stories and escape the complexities of my own. The routine was comforting, and slowly, I began to feel like I was rebuilding the pieces of my shattered life, but there was still one piece that didn't quite fit, Javier. I hadn't heard from him since the day I left the farm, and a part of me had hoped that I never would. But life has a way of confronting you with the things you'd rather avoid, and that confrontation came one quiet evening as I was preparing to close the shop, the bell above the door jingled, and I looked up to see Javier standing there, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, regret, perhaps, Paula, he said, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. I've been looking for you, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Javier, what are you doing here, he stepped further into the store, his eyes searching mine. I needed to see you. I couldn't just leave things the way they were, I took a deep breath, trying to steady the swirling emotions inside me. There's nothing left to say, Javier. We made our choices, and we have to live with them. Maybe, he said quietly, but there's something you need to know. Something I didn't tell you before, I frowned, confused. What do you mean, he hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Before all of this started, before you and Marcos and I had a conversation. He told me he was worried about you, about your loneliness. He asked me to keep an eye on you, to make sure you were okay, I stared at him, stunned. He asked you to, what? To watch over me, Javier nodded, his expression filled with regret. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's how it started. I was just trying to be there for you, to make sure you didn't feel alone. But somewhere along the way, it became more. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship was being turned upside down. So, this whole thing, it started because of Marcos, yes, Javier admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I crossed a line I never should have crossed. And for that, I'm sorry, I didn't know what to say. The revelation left me reeling, forcing me to confront a truth I hadn't considered. Our affair, the thing that had torn my life apart, had its roots in something far more complicated than I had realized, I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can forgive myself, Javier looked at me with sorrow in his eyes. I understand. I just wanted you to know the truth. I thought you deserved that, at least, we stood there in silence, the weight of his confession settling between us. And then, for the first time, I realized that I didn't hate Javier. I didn't even hate myself, not really. We had both made terrible choices, but we were human. Flawed and vulnerable, I think it's time for both of us to move on, I said quietly. To let go of the past and find a way to live with what we've done, Javier nodded, a sad smile on his lips. I think you're right. I'll be leaving town soon. I need a fresh start. Maybe you do too, maybe, I replied, feeling a strange sense of peace. Goodbye, Javier. I hope you find what you're looking for, goodbye, Paula, he said, and with one last look, he turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the night, I watched him go, knowing that this was the end of a chapter in my life, a chapter filled with mistakes, but also lessons that I would carry with me forever. As I locked up the store and walked home, I felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift, the next morning, I mailed Marcos's wedding ring back to him, along with a letter. I told him everything, about Javier's confession, about the guilt I had carried, about my hope that one day we could both find peace. And then, I let it go, as I dropped the letter in the mailbox, I felt a sense of finality. My story wasn't over yet. There were still chapters to be written, still lessons to be learned. But for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next, with a heart that was finally beginning to heal, before you leave, remember to subscribe.